started. Hopefully Steve will be joining us shortly, but I think we should get underway. We will adjourn precisely at 1:30, if not before, and we should have plenty of time for comments and discussion. First of all, I want to welcome you. I'm Rob Atkinson. I'm president of ITIF and co-author of the paper we're releasing today. Let me start by introducing our three respondents. Hopefully Steve will be here. To my immediate left is Bill Bonvillian. Many of you have known Bill has a long and distinguished career in technology policy in Washington. His current role is he's director of MIT's Washington, D.C. office. He's been doing that since 2006. And prior to that, he served 17 years as LD and chief counsel for Senator Joe Lieberman. And whenever you wanted to talk to the person in the Senate who knew the most about technology policy, it was Bill. So the Senate's loss is MIT's gain, and Bill continues to be quite active in this area. And with his colleague Chuck Weiss wrote a book which I would really encourage you all to read, Structuring an Energy Revolution, which is really the first book, and I think the best book. Easy to be the best when you're the first. It really is a great book about the actual innovation process in the clean energy space, which has been sort of widely ignored up until now. Devon Swezey is the project director at the Breakthrough Institute. For those of you who don't know, Breakthrough is really, I think, the best group in the country working on these issues. They're out in California. They do really wonderful work on clean energy innovation. How do we get to the breakthroughs we need for solving climate change, energy security, and other related problems. He's the lead author of a report that we co-issued with Breakthrough last year called Rising Tiger, Sleeping Giant, which looked at how Japan, Korea, China, and the U.S. were structuring their clean energy policies and how we were woefully behind. He's also taken the lead on several other reports, including a report strengthening clean energy opportunities for American peace that he did with us. But he actually does work on his own. He doesn't just work with us. He does great work on his own. Has written, he was one of the first, wrote the first article to call for the Apollo Project, and written in Business Week, Forbes, and a number of other outlets. I'll take the liberty of introducing Steve, even though he's not here. Hopefully he will arrive shortly. Steve Hayward is the F.K. Weyerhaeuser Fellow in Law and Economics at the American Enterprise Institute, and also a Senior Fellow at the Pacific Research Institute in California. Steve holds a PhD in American Studies and an MA in Government from Claremont Graduate School. He's a visiting professor at Georgetown University. He's written a wide array of publications, including on issues around environmentalism and climate change and energy policy, including in the National Review, the American Spectator, Public Interest, Policy Review, New York Times, Washington Post, etc. So he obviously has a long and distinguished background there. So let me start by sort of trying to frame this, I guess. I mean, why did we write this esoteric and obscure argument about these sort of strange and esoteric notions of economic doctrines or paradigms? We did that because, in our view, when you look at the debate over climate change, it's really striking in the sense that there's very, very little consensus over what to do. And leaving aside the people who think that this is some sort of climate change isn't real, or those folks, leaving those folks aside, among the reasonable people in the world who think that climate change is real and it's man-made, there's a very, very significant difference of views on what we should do about it. And you could put these, I would argue, into four big camps. There's the carbon tax camp, there's the carbon trading camp, there's the sort of more direct emission regulations and subsidies camp, and then there's more of the innovation camp, if you will. That certainly we, and I think everybody so far right here is more in that camp. Why is it so hard to come up with why don't we commission the National Academy of Sciences to go and tell us what the right solution is? I'm sure they could come up with some computer model and a bunch of data and crank it out and say this is the right solution. The reason we don't do that is because no one knows what the right solution is. The solution set is so common, and the problems are so complex that you can't rely on some sort of empirical model to tell you what to do. What you end up relying on for policymakers, advocates, legislators, are essentially sort of worldviews, sort of how you think the world operates, how you think markets work, how you think markets don't work. And these end up shaping, we would argue, how climate change has been structured to date. There's a very nice article in the New York Times on Sunday by David Siegel, who was talking about sort of why economics isn't really a science. And he said this nice quote, which was, quote, "It's not just that there is so little clear signal among so much noise, it's that many economists have a unique idea of what signal to listen to and what priority it deserves." And, that's about sort of regular economics. Climate change, there's a lot more noise than there is signal, and a lot stronger views about which noise or signal you want to listen to. And that's really, I would argue, the role that economic doctrines play. Economists like to pretend and tell everybody that we're like physicists. We actually are scientists. Just trust us. We know what we're doing. And I think that worked very well. Did it a few years ago when they really had no clue what they were doing, and ended up almost destroying the economy. But leaving that aside, Schumpeter once stated a great quote. Joseph Schumpeter, the patron saint of innovation economics, an Austrian immigrant to the U.S. with Harvard economics, and head of the American Economics Association, quote, said, quote, "The majority of economists are ready enough to admit the presence of ideology, but like Marx, they find it only in others and never in themselves. They do not admit that it is an inescapable curse and vitiates economics to its core." So really, when you think about economics, I think you have to understand, at least our argument is that there is no such thing as an economic science. There are economic positions, economic worldviews, or economic doctrines. And in a prior report last year, my colleague David Adresh, who's an economist at Indiana, and I wrote a report. We tried to lay this out, and we argued there were 4 competing doctrines in Washington. Competing is a little bit too strong a term because there's really sort of like there's the Chicago Bears and there's the New England Patriots, and then there's like this minor league team that we're sort of on. Not because of the intellectual quality, just because there's so many more of these other folks. But it's basically what you would call conservative neoclassical economics. So think sort of Bush supply side economics. Liberal neoclassical economics. Think Rubinomics. Think Clinton economics. Neo Keynesian economics, which is a sort of modified Keynesian response to neoclassical economics. Think Economic Policy Institute, for example, very much about government spending driving the economy. And then what we would argue is innovation economics. Let me just very quickly just go through what these big frames are all about. Liberal and conservative neoclassical economics are really based upon one key thing. And if you understand that, you basically understand it all, which is that an economy is made up largely of rational, independent actors who make decisions based upon price signals. So my son recently took the AP macroeconomics test. I had to advise him not to answer the questions the way, I advised him not to answer it the right way because he would have failed the test to get the answers, but the wrong way, the way they do it. So in the very first sentence of his AP book he got, studying for the AP test, it says, economics is the study of the allocation of scarce goods and resources. And that's how economists think about the world. You have this sort of fixed set of resources. They're allocated by price. If price goes up, you get less. If price goes down, you get more. And economic growth is maximized by making sure that those prices are a reflection of true costs. So the worst thing you can do if you're a neoclassical economist, you will get kicked out of economics. You have to turn in your economics membership card if you advocate for this kind of thing. Regulations, taxes, market power, and other distortions are all seen as taboo because they minimize allocation efficiency. They're substituting something else than just the price signal. And when you do that, you get what neoclassical economists call deadweight loss. So the worst thing you can do is raise the price of wheat with a tax, because then people will be consuming too much rice, and there are terrible things that will happen to the economy because of that. Too much rice, people will eat. So what's the difference? Why is there a liberal camp and a conservative camp? Basically, it's really between those two camps. It's sort of an order of magnitude. I mean, a difference of degree, if you will. Conservatives tend to view that market failures are very limited, largely driven by government intervention, and liberals are more willing to consider that there are market failures. They just don't think there's a lot of them, but they're more willing to consider that there's some there. And the other major difference between liberals and conservatives on this is that liberals tend to be willing to acknowledge the importance of fairness. So there's a wonderful book by Alan Blinder called Hard Minds and Soft Hearts, something like that. And Blinder basically says, we as economists know that if we help the poor, it's going to hurt economic growth, and it's going to harm economic welfare, but as liberals, we're willing to help the poor. So in the neoclassical framework, anything you would do to help the poor by raising taxes, for example, and redistributing or having regulations to hurt the economy, but because they're liberal, neoclassicals are like, we're willing to do that. The third major group, and this would be a group that was sort of in power, if you will, before the 70s, before Nixon came into power, and is there what we call Neo Keynesians. Neo Keynesians is basically the fundamental view of Keynesians in terms of how the economy works. Is it's largely economies are driven by the demand side. The thing about economy is you have the supply side of producers, firms, organizations who are producing goods and services, and then consumers who are on the demand side. Neo-Keynesians essentially think that you drive economic welfare by having more demand for goods and services. They don't really think very much about the supply side. That in many ways was why the supply side revolution under Reagan was a revolution. Because now, for the first time, you had an economics that was thinking about the supply side. Keynesians largely don't think about the supply side, at the demand side. And that's why they are more willing to engage in a set of policies that neoclassicals would question. So, for example, regulation, subsidies for clean energy, and other kinds of policies. Their view of Keynesian is there's not much government can do to hurt the demand, the supply side of the economy. You're just really trying to help the demand side. If we can grow the demand for these technologies by subsidies or regulation, that's going to grow the overall economy. And the last tenet, or the last doctrine would be what we would call innovation economics. These are folks like to some extent, Elhanan Helpman up at Harvard, and Darren Asegemlu up at MIT, and Paul Romer and other folks, Richard Nelson at Columbia, to essentially say, wait a minute, what the economy is really about is innovation. So there's a wonderful line by Robert Solow a few years, 30, 40 years ago, where he posited that innovation is manna from heaven. In other words, in the conventional neoclassical model, innovation is what's called outside the model. It's exogenous to the model. And what's happened in the last decade or so is a lot of newer economists, younger economists, have said, wait a minute, innovation is the main thing. And Solow's model early on showed that innovation is 70, 80, sometimes even in the model, 90% of per capita income growth is from innovation. That's the development and adoption of new products, processes, and business models. Maybe we should put that in the model. So innovation economics says that innovation is the main thing you want. You don't really care about allocation and efficiency. What you care about is driving firms and organizations to be more productive and more innovative. And that the way these systems work are not really about price-mediated transactions. These are about complex institutional systems where firms are in high levels of uncertainty. There's all sorts of market failures, if you will, chicken or egg problems, path dependency, a whole set of things like that, which suggest that you have to have an innovation policy. Okay, having set that all up, let me go through and talk about climate change. And I think those four doctrines are very sort of emblematic and representative of a lot of economic, if not all economic thinking in Washington. And so how does the different doctrines think about that? If you think about what neoclassical economics is about in climate change, it really is about one thing. At the end of the day, you boil it all down to one thing, and that's set the price on carbon. So they're willing to acknowledge that there's a market failure because carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions generally impose a cost on the world. That cost is not borne by the producers of those emissions, and therefore you have allocated inefficiency. The way you correct for that is you price that at the full cost of whatever that price is for the cost of the global economy. You impose that price on emitters. Therefore, when you do that, you have the correct price signal. Everybody in the system, producers, consumers, and entrepreneurs, will now do the right thing. They will consume less carbon, and they'll produce other technologies that produce less carbon. The major advantage for neoclassical economists of this model is that it doesn't imply that the government is distorting the market. They're just correcting for a price failure. And it doesn't have the government picking any individual companies. It doesn't say to the marketplace, we think that this kind of solar is better than that, or this wind is superior to geothermal or something. Just as you guys figure it out in the marketplace. So there's neoclassical folks like Greg Mankiw, former economic advisor under Bush, or Larry Summers, current, soon to be gone, economic advisor under President Obama. They both embrace this notion of just set the price. Now, the conservative neoclassicalist sort of would add to this that says, well, we really think that price is the key thing. The way we want to do it is through a carbon tax. So it's kind of just set the carbon tax, and then everything more or less is good to go. But they usually add another wrinkle to it, which is because many of them believe that government spending is inherently harmful to the economy, much of it. They suggest that a carbon tax be revenue neutral. And so Art Laffer, for example, the father of the Laffer curve, if you remember that, Art Laffer says we need to impose a tax on the things we want less of, i.e. carbon dioxide, and reduce taxes on the things we want more of, i.e. income and jobs. There's kind of a fundamental problem, though, with the sole solution of carbon prices. And I don't mean to diminish that higher carbon prices are a component of the solution. But there's a core fundamental problem of it, which is we just have to go and look in Europe, where they have carbon prices on gasoline of anywhere between $2 to $3 or even $400 a ton. So we're talking on the order of 10 times higher than what carbon taxes or carbon prices in the U.S. are being considered. Anyone even want to tell me how many electric vehicles there are in the Netherlands? The answer would be that I don't think there are any. So you had very high prices for carbon, if you will, in the Netherlands and in Germany and the UK. And they didn't develop electric cars. What they did is they developed small cars. And they drive a lot. I mean, they ride their bike a lot. They take transit, and they live in concentrated development. So what you did with price is you change the use of an existing technology. You just don't develop new technology. And I think in general what we see is the price influences incremental innovation. It doesn't influence radical breakthrough innovation. And as we would argue, but that's essentially what we need. Liberal neoclassicalists also favor price. They just favor it in a slightly different way. This gets a little complicated, but I think when you talk about cap and trade, it's really about two things. It's cap and trade. The liberal neoclassicalists like the trade part of cap and trade. So they've embraced cap and trade because they see it as a trading mechanism that brings this notion of the market setting prices into the into the climate change solution set. So they essentially are saying we want to get markets to help set the price on carbon. But we're going to do it through this thing called cap and trade. Partly because as liberals, as opposed to conservative neoclassicals, they're more willing to say that there are market failures and there's a role for government. So they're more willing to kind of go that next step and say, rather than just set the price, we're going to set the cap. One of the problems, though, with cap and trade is that it's sort of the same problem with carbon prices. The notion somehow that setting a cap, in other words, imposing a price somehow, will get you innovation, I think is quite limited. So the third main doctrine or approach is really what you could call the Neo Keynesian approach. These would be folks, I think, for example, Joe Romm, Center for American Progress, or Nicky Roy, Pew, or various kind of most environmental organizations would be in this camp. And there, the view is that there's really kind of three things you've got to do. You've got to just basically just regulate carbon. So you just set a cap on it. And for most Neo-Keynesians, their view of a trading part of the cap is just, we're willing to do the trade part. It's a useful thing. But the part they really stress is the cap part. It's you're capping these emissions. You're just saying, okay, no more carbon or no more growth in carbon. In addition to that, they would be much more willing to impose just direct regulations on a set of other things. So, for example, renewable energy portfolio standards, which is essentially a regulatory solution that says you want more clean energy, you just say 20% of your electricity buy has got to be clean energy. Or you want more energy efficiency, buildings and cars have to be more energy efficient. And the last sort of tool, I think, that if you look at the folks who are embracing that Neo-Keynesian view of climate change is subsidization. So for many of them, a lot of the policies, such as feed-in tariffs, electric vehicle tax credits, green banks, cash for cockers, these various kinds of tools are essentially designed to bring the higher price of clean down to at or below the cheaper price of dirty. It's not really designed in any serious way, I would argue, to bring the real price down. It's about to bring the real cost down. It's about designing it in a way that says we're going to use subsidies by government to reduce that gap and make them viable in the marketplace. I think there's several problems with that approach. One is that I think there's really a misunderstanding or unwillingness to look in the cap and trade world or the cap world that you can only do one of two things. That you can either set a price on something and not know what the quantity is, or you can set the quantity and not know what the price is. You can't do both at once. And if you set the cap and you set it too high, or too low, I should say, we have no idea what the prices will be. And it could be that if new solutions don't emerge, you'll end up with enormously high prices on carbon that politically are not feasible, and then this whole system would fall apart. So I think there's sort of a naivety on the cap and trade view of the world is that somehow we'll just set the cap. You want less carbon, you just bring it down. Well, the reality is that unless you get clean energy solutions or low carbon solutions to that, you end up raising the price so dramatically that it becomes really an unfeasible tool from a political perspective. I think the second big problem with cap and to some extent subsidy is, at the end of the day, unlike nitrous oxide or other kinds of pollutants that are national or regional in scale, CO2 is an international pollutant. It doesn't really matter where it comes from, it's all going in the atmosphere. So the only real answer to climate change is a global solution. And having one country set a cap, unless that cap derives clean energy innovation, is essentially not a solution at all. It's just a little bit of a getting away there. One of the things that we've said earlier, and other folks have said this, if you want to end up with a 50% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2050, because of population growth and income growth throughout the world, economic growth, you have to get to 87% carbon efficiency. In other words, everything we do in every country around the world has got to be 87% more efficient. And that's just not going to happen in our view with kind of the conventional view. So let me close by saying, what do you do? What's the other alternative? And what we would argue is that an innovation economics-based approach to climate change is a more appropriate one. And that essentially, the innovation economics approach would say, yes, getting the price signals right is useful, it's necessary, but certainly by no means sufficient. As I mentioned before, innovation economics approach says that you can't solve climate change without a significant revolution in much better, cheaper, and more effective energy that we have today, and that neither price nor regulation can get us there. Not to say that price nor regulation isn't useful, but they're nowhere near sufficient. The reason they're nowhere near sufficient, and this kind of goes to the fundamental point of innovation economics, is that particularly in sectors where you have a lot of market failures, if you will, like lock-in, like low investment levels, like monopoly, you have real limitations on innovation occurring sort of naturally, if you will. So you have a whole set of market failures, information asymmetries, uncertainty, issues around where you have chicken or egg issues. I mean, are we going to develop electric cars without plug-in stations, or are we going to develop plug-in stations with electric cars? So to develop the kind of innovation that we need in that system, where a system that is even more rife with market failures than, let's say, the semiconductor industry or the food industry or other kinds of industries that work pretty well, although still there are market failures, energy is much worse as a sector, and that the only way to really respond to that is to have a proactive clean energy innovation policy that seeks out to identify where those market failures are and how to then intervene in those market failures in a way that supports fairly significant innovation, and whether that's innovation from some entrepreneur coming up with an idea or innovation with existing companies, existing products and companies, and then getting those to be more efficient and even better. That's really, I think, the key. So I guess I would close by saying, I hope that, I think in each of the doctrines there are kernels of truth, if you will. There are insights that are important to go forward. And if I were being Pollyannish, I would say we're all going to get together after January. We're all going to say, yes, there's components here that all work and all need to be there, and hopefully we would argue that there's some kind of consensus position that could emerge that takes some of the insights, particularly around price, with innovation to drive a U.S. clean energy innovation policy. So with that, I'll stop and turn it over to Bill for comments.
Unfortunately for you, I've learned from Defense Department friends and colleagues that it's impossible to think unless you have a PowerPoint framework. Now that leads to many faulty and painful misunderstandings, but bear with me. Maybe this will work.
There's also some chairs up here.
Yeah, come on
for
come on
in
in.
the back.
There's plenty of space. I want to just, in a few minutes, just touch on 4 topics. First, I think that this is an important report. It really draws the contending intellectual economic battle lines which need to be understood and wrestled with. And secondly, I want to go back to the neoclassical debate over growth theory, because I think there's some lessons here that we need to understand. Third, I want to draw an analogy with the neoclassic response to the role of innovation-based growth in the current recession, and then draw from that the next task, which is, given the failure of carbon price politics, what can innovation economics bring to the energy debate? Because in effect, the door is now open. Topic number 1. Growth innovation economics has been struggling to find a policy basis really since it was formulated by people like Solow and Romer and Nelson. The approach in the report that Doreen and Rob have worked on, I think, is a very important advance because it really draws the policy battle lines out. In other words, it ties economic theory to the contending ideologies in the policy marketplace that are battling here, so we can get down to the doctrinal foundations. And technology policy, which is part of what Rob and Doreen are arguing for, really hasn't been conducted by economists predominantly. It's really been led by practitioners, whether they're in industry or in government agencies or in think tanks or in academia. They have been separated in a way from the economic underlying theories and theorists. And this report is interesting because it ties the policy base back to the doctrinal economic roots. And therefore, I strongly recommend that you spend some time with it. It's lengthy, it's detailed, but I think it's very rewarding. Now, just to emphasize again what Rob was pointing out, this report doesn't repudiate neoclassical economics, but it really attempts to build in a new kind of foundational element that's been lurking there for some time. So I want to bring today's report and the debate today to recall Solo's debate over growth theory, over the growth theory behind classical economics, because I think there's some very important analogies here and implications that we've never fully played. You know, in '87, Solo wins the Nobel Prize by essentially completely overturning classical growth theory. And while I've got a little more detail on what that debate was actually about in some of these bullet points here, in essence, you know, he was arguing that the fundamental factors of growth theory in classical economics, capital supply, labor supply, including the national savings rate, i.e. income saved, it was a static view. These factors were in an equilibrium system. You were constantly struggling to bring these factors into balance. They constantly offset each other. There was forever an unbalance in the model, and turned capitalism into alternating periods of worsening unemployment or labor shortages, one or the other. And then, you know, Solo, and this is on the right, is Solo, the only economist who's received the, you know, National Medal of Technology, I think for good reason. Solo lands in this debate, and he says that the story told by these classical models felt wrong. And he thinks about replacing the capital and labor output data with what he calls a richer and more realistic representation of technology, which he goes on to call technological and related innovation. It's not solely the technology, it's a bundle of stuff around the technology and related applications that he's driving at. And he argues that old growth theory was mechanical, it was really a description of the flows and stocks of goods. And he argues that classical economics failed to really understand growth, and he brings forth a theory that sees capitalism and growth as dynamic, and thereby he completely transforms growth theory. So his basic point about classical economics is that no amount of statistical evidence, and there was plenty behind those theories, will make a statement invulnerable to common sense. And that's what he was trying to do when he created a whole new theoretical framework behind growth. So Solo's good news is that you can increase your rate of economic growth through technological advance, and you can improve real incomes and societal well-being. And it's a good news story. You're no longer in this black equilibrium box. You've got a dynamic force in your hands, and you can move growth from one plateau to another. So in effect, after 150 years or so of economics, he finds a third monster in the room, along with capital supply and labor supply, this technological and related innovation, as he calls it. But he still treats his policy, because of the difficulty of fixing it into the foundations of neoclassical economics, very metrics and mathematically based. It's very hard to fit a very complex system that he's beginning to capture into a more straightforward approach of neoclassical economics, reliance on metrics and math. So in a way, we've never, despite efforts by other growth theorists like Romer to make growth theory endogenous, we've never really followed through on a policy perspective that pushes the logic of this vision that Solo gave to us. And the ITIF report essentially says, well, we can no longer wait for this, right? We have to do it. And in a way, we're at the same moment with neoclassical economics that Solo was at with classical economics back in 1987. No amount of statistical evidence will make a statement invulnerable to common sense. We're at one of those common sense moments, and we're going to have to drive the logic of growth economics, innovation economics, to more logical conclusions than we've reached so far. So let's do an analogy to our current economic circumstances. You know, we've got the Great Recession, we've got 10% unemployment, we've got 44 million people, the poverty level 1 in 7, and the toolkit that we've had from neoclassical economics is problematic. I mean, as Rob summarized in some detail, you know, the condition of growth for growth in neoclassical economics has been maximizing allocated efficiency. It's in the in equilibrium based theory. Its pricing signals predominate. You look at things like interest rate, currency supply, inflation, monetary policy, and assume a pursuit of rational self-interest. It's of course measurement-based, which is obviously quite important, but there's some things in complex systems that are very hard to put into those categories, from organization theory to psychology to culture. You can't really count that. So markets are everything, and you try to avoid distortions, and you try to avoid interventions, but the interventions are nonetheless massive. And there's this relentless tension between conservative and liberal sides of neoclassical economics about correcting market failures by public goods or offsetting externalities or supporting promotion, transparency, economic competition, or allowing new entrants despite economies of scale. I mean, all these traditional problems that you've got to wrestle with that in the end involve systematic interventions. And then there's a deep Keynesian lesson long since grafted on neoclassical economics that if markets collapse, what's the remedy? It's bailouts, it's safety nets, it's lower interest rates. So in the end, it turns out to be a damage control. And there's no real doctrinal base for the recovery stage. There's a doctrinal base for the stabilization. But there's only a waiting solution at the end of the stabilization. And I think it's fair to say that the recession says we've got to have some new tools. Therefore, growth, innovation, economics may have a contribution to make here. Can we bring on, new wedges of growth? Because we've got a structural recession where, over 2/3, probably 3/4 at least, of jobs lost in this recession, as was the case with the last recession. It began to happen with the recession before that. These jobs will never come back. So there's going to have to be new sectors, new growth sectors in the economy. It's really the only move that we've got. And therefore, innovation economics has a contribution to make. So can we bring on, we'll never bring on full waves in short order, but can we start the wedges of growth and the creation of new sectors? In other words, can things like public R&D start to leverage private sector investment? Can we get that movement towards growth starting in the economy? So, there's examples here that we can use. One is the incredible advances that are happening in robotics and advanced IT, and incredible advanced materials that are starting to come about. A lot of nano opportunities are starting to occur in many sectors of the economy, but of course, we come to energy. And, my last topic that I just want to touch on very briefly gets to the heart of the report that Doreen and Rob have worked on. For 15 years, since before the Kyoto Protocol, the U.S. has assumed that cap and trade is the policy answer to our energy challenge. We had no plan B. Well, this is a particularly interesting moment because the carbon price approach has politically fallen off the table, at least for a significant period of time. And can there be a set of technology advanced policies that will kind of keep us in progress on a carbon reduction track? So we can all start to think about what Plan B would look like. There's a different political driver and rationale that could be built with energy security and economic competitiveness. We can think about a series of approaches on technology strategy and support. Interestingly, our R&D programs have assumed let's just get new technologies out there. We're now going to have a double problem of not only getting new technologies out there, but without a cap and trade system to offset externalities, at least for the time being. You've got to think very hard about it. An R&D and technology strategy that's actually going to bring low-cost goods onto the market so that they're going to be able to compete. A much tougher technology role than what we've been assuming. How do we create, the kind of movement and flow that can create initial markets if we're not going to have a cap and trade system for a while? Well, there's been considerable consideration to the Department of Defense and its historical role as an initial market. And it looks like DoD actually has got some very real tactical and strategic concerns about its own energy use that might lead in this direction. And you start to think about the annual military construction appropriations bill, and there's a real funding flow. There's a guaranteed guaranteed $20 billion a year of funding flow that could provide something to leverage off of. Ag department can play an interesting role. You can start to kind of rethink these things. There's certainly residual regulatory authorities that could help in this kind of market equalization process. You could start to think about the regions around the country that in themselves are sizable economies. You can start thinking about entry through these regional economies. You can think of a public good relationship for some key sectors like carbon capture and sequestration, and possibly transport. And you can think about, some companies want to make progress here, creating information transparency and a registration process for progress that was accountable and sound could be a very important step. I mean, this is just touching on the menu. These are just some thoughts. But the real important point here is that the report sends us towards is that with the carbon price mechanism kind of off the table for a significant period of time, what are the economic innovation policies that we need in energy? Because not only is that policy point off the table, but the whole neoclassical foundation behind it, the set of assumptions behind it, is also off the table. So there's a very interesting opening here to push the sort of policy dimension of innovation economics, of growth economics. And this technology policy challenge really becomes a technology challenge and a policy challenge. So, terrific report, Ron.
Thank you, Bill. Devon, and again, there's some more seats up here. If you just want to come on up, they'll be back.
Well, thanks, Rob and ITIF for having me. I want to congratulate Rob on publishing this really fantastic report. And I actually agree with Bill, and I'm glad that he said that the political space is now kind of opening up for Plan B on climate change. And I really think that that's what this report is all about, and what we've been working on as well at the Breakthrough Institute. And I think that this report really forcefully and cogently outlines a new path forward on emerging climate policy, grounded in this new doctrine of innovation economics. And in my remarks today, I'd like to reiterate a few of the things in the report about how I think that the dominant neoclassical and Neo Keynesian policies have been misapplied to the issue of mitigating climate change, but also speak in particular about the politics of climate policy. This is something that Rob touches on a bit in the report and did a little bit today, but I think this is really important at this particular moment. So first on the politics. The publication of this report comes at an important time. In the last 2 years, we've seen the collapse of what we at the Breakthrough Institute call the pollution paradigm, as well as the collapse of the neoclassical pricing paradigm with respect to climate and energy policy. The pollution paradigm, which is a very Neo-Keynesian idea that Rob talks about in the report, is that global warming is the same as other conventional pollution problems, and that therefore the set of solutions for global warming will be the same as conventional pollution problems. The neoclassical pricing paradigm is the idea that if we want to discourage the use of something, we can just tax it, or in some cases tax it out of existence. And cap and trade, which is of course the most common climate policy around today, is sort of the love child of the pollution paradigm and neoclassical pricing paradigm, with the cap ostensibly acting as an overall limit on emissions and the trading element creating the price for emissions. And today, I want to argue that climate policy informed by these two paradigms is everywhere in collapse. At the global level, the collapse of the Copenhagen climate negotiations spelled the end of the idea that we will ever have a comprehensive global agreement centered on reducing pollution. It was also the end of the fantasy held by many neoclassical economists that we'll ever have a global carbon market or a global harmonized price for carbon, which is required to maximize what Rob calls allocated efficiency in this report. In the United States, the failure of cap and trade for the fourth time in 10 years, as well as similar failures in France and Australia and elsewhere, has laid bare the political problems with conventional climate and energy policy that is based primarily around raising the price of fossil fuels. Conventional climate policy runs straight into what Roger Pielke Jr., who is a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder and one of the Breakthrough Institute's senior fellows, calls the iron law of climate policy, which is simply that the public is willing to pay something to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, but that willingness has its limits. A good example of the iron law at work is the case of India, which last June proposed lifting a small fraction of subsidies on kerosene, diesel, and petroleum. The increase was the equivalent of enacting a tax of $30 per ton of carbon dioxide. The move incited waves of protests and riots in the country, and the government was forced to delay the implementation of the reforms. And to understand why conventional climate policy has failed so spectacularly, in my view, it's important to go back to the roots of these ideas and describe how they've been misapplied to the problem of mitigating climate change. The pollution paradigm emerged out of successful efforts in the 1970s to curb harmful pollutants, things like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, which were very successful. At the international level, the Montreal Protocol, for phasing out CFCs, was successful in getting countries to restrict those chemicals. And Montreal later became a model for the Kyoto Protocol years later. Cap and trade, of course, was successfully applied to the problem of acid rain in the United States, as the ITIF report notes, and helped meet pollution reduction goals at low cost. In each of these cases, however, the common mechanism that made both policies successful was that cheap and reliable replacement technologies were available and existed prior to the policy taking effect. In the case of CFCs, low-cost alternatives to ozone-depleting chemicals were invented before Montreal. Acid rain legislation regulated a single pollutant emitted by a relatively small number of plants, and inexpensive smokestack scrubbers, as well as low-sulfur coal from Wyoming, were available to allow the cap-and-trade system to operate at relatively low cost. But the issue of climate change mitigation is orders of magnitude more complex and larger. Let's just look at the numbers. In 2007, humans consumed roughly 15 terawatts of energy. That figure is expected to double or even triple over the next 50 years, and the largest amount of that new demand will come from the developing world. If we want to reach what Rob said, which is this 80% carbon efficiency, virtually all of that will have to be new low-carbon power. To give a sense of scale, providing 20 terawatts of energy would require building the equivalent of 20,000 new 1 gigawatt nuclear power plants, or a new reactor every day for the next 50 years. Every day that we do not build one nuclear reactor's worth of low-carbon power is another day that we have to build two in the future. Now, the enormous disparity in the scale and complexity of the climate change problem in relation to acid rain should dispel the notion that solving climate change will be similar to the way that we solve acid rain, which is something that Paul Krugman has said in the New York Times and that Rob quotes in this report. In reality, we do not have low-cost and effective substitutes for fossil fuels the way that we did for CFCs and acid rain. And this is why conventional climate policy fails the reality test. Without low-cost clean energy substitutes, the cost of reducing emissions will be prohibitively high. And these high costs have actually led to a very incoherent climate policy, both nationally and globally. Policymakers at once view the high price of fossil fuels as the main mechanism for mitigating climate change, and at the same time seek ways to make sure that the price of fossil fuels remains low. And this is why you don't actually get a cap on carbon emissions. You get a cap shot through with loopholes like carbon offsets, the allocation of allowances, borrowing from the future, and other accounting tricks that by design constrain the cost of the policy. Cap and trade in theory is really visor and trade in practice. You don't get an optimal carbon price. Likewise, you get the price that the public is willing to bear without voting policymakers out of office. And if I had my own PowerPoint slides here, we have a good presentation where we show, as they did in my environmental economics course in college, where you put the price on carbon, the supply and demand curves intersect, and you get new clean energy technologies. Well, in our presentation, we have a big boot coming through, which represents the public booting the policymakers out of office for raising the energy prices. So I wish I had that here that I could show you, but unfortunately I don't. And this gets to the larger issue about conventional climate policy, which is that it misclassifies the problem of mitigating climate change as an allocation problem. Again, according to the theory, once the carbon price is set, the opportunities to emit carbon dioxide are allocated efficiently throughout the economy and return the economy to an optimal equilibrium point. But the automatic coordination of supply and demand in these general equilibrium models, going all the way back to Kenneth Arrow in 1950, who pioneered general equilibrium theory, requires that there be substitutes for the goods in question. And without low-cost substitutes for fossil fuels, a low price on carbon may change some behavior at the margin, but will not lead to a large-scale transition away from fossil fuels. Thus, mitigating climate change, as Rob and Bill rightly argue, is really an innovation challenge. It's not an allocation problem. Solving climate change will require that new, reliable, and cost-effective clean energy technologies be developed and widely commercialized. And there's a great joke that I just read the other day when I was looking back through Bill's book, and I'm sorry I'm going to have to steal it because I think it's so good, is that a bunch of neoclassical economists, as well as a few other folks, are careening down in a bus that just went off the cliff. And everybody else is screaming in the bus, but the neoclassical economists are all silent. And the guy looks over to the neoclassical economist and says, well, why are you silent? He says, well, sir, there's so much pent-up demand on this bus, surely a parachute will appear. And in Bill's book, he says that this book is about how we build the parachute. And that's what we need to do with respect to climate energy today. It's about how do we build and develop the new technologies that are going to get us to where we need to go. And unfortunately, conventional climate policy, I want to argue, is also not really optimized to drive innovation. Both neoclassical and Neo Keynesian policies, such as carbon prices or renewable portfolio standards, by design, favor the least cost technologies in existence today, while currently less mature technologies are stranded and may show more promise down the road in becoming cheaper and more effective. And how quickly we reduce emissions depends on this very uncertain and time-intensive process of development and commercialization of new technologies. And traditional climate policies may therefore actually forestall the emergence of new technologies that could move the economy toward clean energy more quickly. And that's why we need a technology-focused innovation policy, which is something we'll talk about today. I don't really want to go over my time, so I'll stop there, but I'm sure we'll be able to talk about what that looks like. Although actually I should add that I regret that Steve is not here, because just last week, the Breakthrough Institute, along with the Brookings Institution and Steve at the American Enterprise Institute, released a new report called Post-Partisan Power, advocating up to $25 billion per year of investment in energy innovation, education, et cetera, to provide a more limited and direct approach, kind of talking about Plan B to what we need to do in climate change. And we can talk about that more, but I just wanted to mention that because I believe Steve would actually have some very similar things to say on this subject.
Okay, thank you, Devon. Thank you, Bill. We've got at least probably half an hour for comments or questions or violent disagreement. So I'll open it up. If you want to offer some, just raise your hand. If not, I'll.
Kevin Farron at the National Academy of Sciences. Firstly, I think it's important to have this sort of theoretical foundation for how we think about energy and energy policy, but also I wonder about the idea of just thinking about energy as if you could talk about the utility sector, the transportation sector, industrial processes, and all the different ways we use energy, as if they were one thing, there was one approach that somehow would work with all of them. So I wonder if you were willing to talk a little bit more about where the focal points are for innovation and change. For instance, if we change behavior enough, we could at least reduce energy demand for a little while. But it would also reduce the incentive to build new power plants because maybe we wouldn't need them and on and on. So, but anyway, I'd just like to hear a little bit more about where these ideas apply and where the opportunities for innovation apply, particularly over different time scales. Utilities that replace their plants every 60 years, cars every 10 years, refrigerators every 15 years, and so on.
Yeah, a couple things, Kevin. One is, I think the way this debate ultimately is going to have to be resolved is going to be drilling down into actually understanding the mechanisms of individual technology systems and individual sectors, and then where public policy can drive it in that direction of more breakthrough innovation and more price reduction, more cost reduction. Having said that, I think sort of the reason why this is a sort of broader intellectual foray, if you will, is because I think we have to first reframe the debate over into this space and get more people to say it's Plan B is really what we need. And Plan A, all these other A-1, A-2, isn't really what's going to get us there. So that's sort of the big sort of frame. The second point is I think one of the failures of neoclassical economics, and they'll say this flat out, they're proud of this statement of neoclassical economics applies to all economies over all periods of time, and there's no difference. So the laws of economics apply equally today as they did 400 years ago. They apply equally today as they do to China and the US, which is, at the end of the day, just nonsensical. it ignores the notion that there are institutions, that there are cultures, that there are different attitudes towards how the economy works. So I think in many ways, an innovation-based economics system approach to climate change is actually more appropriate because it gets you into this fundamental realization that, we need a different set of policies towards our electric generation system than we do for, cars or for other things like that. Going into that next level is really the key. And I know Bill and Devon have both done more work on that, and maybe can offer more specifics on those issues.
The only thing that I would add with respect to the technologies is that it's pretty wide. There's a wide consensus that we do need some fundamental breakthroughs at the level of basic chemistry and a number of technologies. Stephen Chu, Secretary of Energy, shares this view, and he said that we need fundamental breakthroughs to make batteries, for advanced batteries, to increase energy storage, to make solar cells more efficient. Nuclear power plants need to get smaller and cheaper. One focus of the paper that we wrote with the American Enterprise Institute and Brookings Institution is looking at small modular nuclear reactors, kind of 50 to 100 megawatt scale, that the U.S. firm Babcock and Wilcox has said that they are interested in pursuing. So a lot of these technologies that are right now too risky for the private sector to adopt and need a much larger public sector role are the technologies that we need to be looking at in the future, not just basic science, the scientists in universities somewhere thinking about questions that are applicable to the market needs at the moment.
Kevin, you asked a really big question. Now, you have this ideological framework, we're straightening that out. This report focuses on the ideological framework, right? This report, the report is really all about, we've been fooling around with technology, policy, and energy for 40 plus years. Maybe we ought to go look at the underlying ideological disputes and understand where they have driven us. And that's why I think this is important. Right? We're kind of going back to the foundation. But, you raise the obvious follow-on problem, which the report starts on. Okay, so you want to do this innovation economic stuff, right? Not in place of, but on top of neoclassical economics, and on top of understanding markets, and on top of the understanding of how products get introduced into markets at massive scale. Because you can't throw this away. You just have to build another element on top of it. The same kind of way which Solo builds technologically related innovation doesn't throw away capital spend and labor spend. They remain very important, right? So we've just got to do the same thing here. I would argue, just add another big foundation on top of this. But then, what does that mean? How does that translate? And I think there's a few kind of big framework ideas for this extremely diverse sector. One is, this is the most complicated technological implementation problem that the country has ever faced, by far. Nothing is close, right? Going to the moon, we knew we had a group of core technologies, we pursued it for 9 years, it was a government contractor model, great. We kind of know how to do those things. We have no idea how to transform a complex, established economic sector over an extended 40-year time. We have never tried to do anything like this. So it is, first, really hard. Second, it is this complex, established sector. And all this stuff has to land in a marketplace. So the technology-driven analogies for the way in which the government has acted in the past, a la Apollo program, a la the other analogy we always love to draw is to the Manhattan Project for energy, right? Those are not very good analogies. This is a much more complicated introduction. Because it's complex, established sector, it's got to land in a marketplace, it's going to call for a completely different kind of innovation strategy than we have in the past. Past innovation strategies have focused on going after completely new territories, completely open fields where there's nothing previously existed. So we do computing, there's nothing really like computing. We do, biotech, there's really nothing like biotech, right? So we're pretty good at doing these complete new things. We've never tried to go back and create, a transformation of an established sector that we built, 150 years So this is going to be really hard. I think we're going to need to do a series of things. I don't want to get into a lot of detail, but we're going to have to understand the different launch trajectories and the different technologies we're going to need, right? And we're going to have to build support mechanisms, because it's not only doing the front end of R&D right, we've got to have a whole set of back-end strategies to ensure that we can introduce this stuff at scale, which means we're back into market-based economics again. And we're going to have to figure out what those launch trajectories are, and then the right mix of support mechanisms to put them in place. And then we're going to have to think about what are our gaps in our current information system, what's missing in our ability to do that. I think if we do these three steps, we'll at least be giving ourselves a framework to start sort of thinking about these problems. That's in a nutshell.
But I think the key to what Bill was saying, and I look at that, is we need a strategy. I was just over this morning, I was moderating a panel at the Chamber of Commerce where they had it was a U.S.-Israeli business partnership conference. And so I was on the panel with three Israeli really cool tech entrepreneurs. One company, I'm sorry I can't remember the name, they invented something, you swallow it and it's a camera. And it has lights on it, you just pill. The guy had it with all these lights, and you swallow, it's a camera, and they can see your insides. And another guy's a big venture capital. But the point they made is Israel actually has a technology strategy. The government has worked with the private sector to develop a coherent strategy. And I get why our politics say, well, maybe we shouldn't do that in certain areas, but I think in energy, it's clear we need a strategy. We need to be thinking through those questions, Kevin, that you looked at, and really drilling down and getting deep in each of these different areas. Whether we can do that is another question, but I think certainly, yes, sir.
Well, let me give perhaps two interesting, relevant dimensions. Sometimes you tend to ask a question based upon your current way of looking at things. When, for example, when people look at a traffic jam, they think we've got a transportation problem, and their brain is looking for a transportation solution. Well, I came to the conclusion that we're not going to build more roads because A, there's no place to build the roads, B, there's no money to build the roads. Maybe we should look inside the car and ask, why are people in the car, where are they going? And an awful lot of people are dressed like we are, and they're commuting to a desk. So I said, maybe this isn't a transportation problem, maybe this is a communications problem, and the default broadband network is asphalt. So when you need bandwidth, you get in your car and you go there. So hence the term virtual adjacency, where you harness computer and communication technology to do an increasing number of things using those technologies instead of transportation. There's a collateral benefit, which is if you mitigate the amount of congestion there is, the cars that are on the road are not nearly as inefficient because they're moving at a constant speed. So that's A. B, we built a rail network, metro rail. We regulate land use with an automobile frame of mind. You don't drive onto a train, you walk onto a train. So we have to fix how we use land within walking distance of rail stations so that more people can function without getting into a car. It took me 7 years to figure that out. And I have a law in Annapolis right now, because zoning is a state function, not a federal function, that is called a state rail station overlay zone. And it completely changes the frame of mind and the role of the participants, government, developers, and citizens, in figuring out how to make land use and transportation function together, creating music instead of noise. Okay. So I guess the analogy of both of those is maybe we need to even step back where we're struggling with an energy problem and go a little bit deeper and ask, why is it that the problem appears to be as big as it is?
I think that's useful insight, because certainly when you look at a lot of the big service innovations or innovations that come out of companies where they reframe a problem and they look at it in a different way, I completely agree with that. I guess our view would be, while certainly you can get efficiencies, and much of what you're talking about is how you get efficiencies. And certainly IT, we've written a lot about that, how IT is driving efficiencies, and with new systems like telepresence that Cisco has and HP and various companies have these very high quality video conferencing. You know, actually the evidence shows that you reduce travel and you know, the next industry that could be in crisis in countries, hotels, I suppose, and airlines. Having said all that, I think those are important steps to take, but they're like carbon pricing in a way. They're not enough, and you know, we can't efficiency our way out of this problem for no other reason than the Indians and the Japanese and the Chinese and other countries are going to get richer, and thank God that they are, because they need to get richer to live a decent life. And when you get richer, you use more energy. And so I think ultimately we have to come up with solutions that are equally applicable here as they are in India. I mean, the analogy I use is where essentially our clean energy system is essentially a Volvo system, and the Indians are driving nanos. In other words, I get 50% of my energy from wind, my electricity in Maryland, but I pay more for it. I don't want to do 100% just on principle. I think the government should do some of it. But I'm like, okay, I'll do 50%. But that's a Volvo energy. I'm paying extra, and we've got to get it to the point where I'm actually saving money by doing that, and that's how we're going to transform this bill.
Yeah, I think it's an important point though that you're driving there, because for one of the very deep problems that we've got with the fact that we're in an established energy sector already is that the first generation of technologies that's going to come along is not going to change the functionality from existing technologies. All right, now people will pay a premium for new functionality. Right, they will pay a very high price for that, and then over time that price gets driven down. Right, we've seen that again and again in modern technology. It's very hard for that phenomena to work when you're just simply introducing comparable functionality, right? In other words, as long as an electric car drives roughly like an internal combustion engine, there's not a whole lot of new functionality that's going to encourage people to pay $40,000 for the Volt as opposed to $20,000 for the other thing, right? Or as long as we plug in appliances to the grid, what's the new functionality there? So, your point is maybe there's some new functionalities out there that could create completely new lines of products and services that would encourage reductions. And so I think that one of the things we're going to have to do, if there's not going to be a carbon price for a significant period of time because of the politics of it, we're going to have to think hard about how we can introduce technologies that bring new functionalities to this energy marketplace, because that could be a very interesting mechanism around the traditional high price problem of new goods entering the marketplace.
Yes, sir. If you could also identify yourself too.
My name is Mark Mutasoni. I'm a consultant expert in climate change stuff. I'm curious to ask you the question, if when you started your paper, if you also looked at or considered things like behavioral economics and happiness economics, because I think they may add another element to the analysis, and because in all the discussions we had, to some extent the underlying assumption was that growth is almost like an end result, rather than aiming to achieve another end, which is what we really need at the end. So I wonder how that could play into your discussion, both in terms of achieving the goals, but maybe also in terms of how do we then steer innovation, what is priority.
Yeah, the other background paper out there that I did with David Dresch that gets into much more detail on behavioral economics. For those who don't know, behavioral economics is a quasi-new field of economics. It's positing that people don't act rationally. See, there's a surprise. Sort of one of those things, Bill, usually, where we all know it's common sense, but the models say opposite. It's like, yeah, we all know we don't behave rationally. In many cases, people behave fundamentally irrationally. The best case of that was, I think, a group of students at Harvard where they were asked if you could make, let's just use a number, $100,000, but all of your cohorts make $150,000 or $200,000. Would you rather have that, or would you rather make $90,000 and they all make $70,000? Most people took the latter, which is totally irrational. You're $10,000 worse off with the latter choice. An economist would say a rational person would always take the 100. In fact, people behave as part of a group. There's positional goods, and positional goods matter to people as irrational as some people think that is. So I think that behavioral economics is a sort of one more, if you will, intellectual attack at the neoclassical framework, because it goes at the core thing of neoclassical economics, which is rationality. And once you take away rationality, then you're left with not as much of it. I'm not sure how it applies here. I guess the happiness economics part, there's a lot of different research on that that shows that, do people get richer? Do people get happier when they get richer? I may not be happier, but I certainly am happier when I'm watching football on my HD TV. I'm happy for a few hours a week, thinking, God, I used to watch this on a little TV with all fuzzy. Anyway, being more serious, I do think, though, that happiness economics is an important point, but it doesn't, to me, obviate the need for growth. It just suggests where that growth is going to go. So I would much rather, let's just say, and this is my own choice, for society has to do this, but I would much rather have high productivity growth and have some of it go to reduced work week, for example. But you can't get reduced work week. Most people won't accept reduced work week if that means reduced money. Like that's the average American. If you would poll them today, you ask them, what do you want, more time or money? They'll say money. So I think the happiness economics suggests that you can make those trade-offs, but I still think it doesn't move you away from growth. You still want to have high productivity growth and high innovation. I mean, the idea is somehow that we're not going to, in the next 30 years, we're going to have an enormous array of wonderful innovations in the world, and they're going to make our lives a lot better. I mean, I just got a new phone, and it was like 3 years. My old phone was 3 years old. I'm like, wow, how could I have lived without this phone? I threw my old phone away, 3 years old. What a piece of junk. Now I got this great phone. So my point is that innovation still is really good. It makes people's lives better. And I think in the energy spaces, I think we need to be thinking about it that way. How can we drive an energy revolution that's going to make our lives better? And that goes to Bill's point, not just about wearing the hair shirt of getting rid of carbon. Maybe we can think about a much better system. We're right back here, and then we'll go here and then here.
Thanks. My name's Andy Stocking. I'm with the Congressional Budget Office. So I apologize for whatever labels I'm carrying with me as an economist.
You could be an innovation economist in the closet.
Well, I'm not completely convinced that the battle lines that you've drawn are as clear as they are, because I think, as you I think alluded to earlier, there's a lot of these are complementary policies that come out of. But one of the interesting, the solo models where growth is the fuel to the economy are really good models. And you made the comment earlier that the sort of goal of innovation economists is about finding the market failures and correcting them. And two of the really interesting questions, I think, around growth economics, one is, where does the seed for new technologies come from? Because all of these models are silent on where do you get that new sort of piece of sand that the pearl forms around. And then the second thing is, how do we put a policy in place that doesn't just promote small marginal improvements in existing technologies? And I think a good example is the internal combustion engine. I mean, we as a society are incredibly dedicated to this engine. And so when we put lots of money towards innovation in engines, it all tends to go towards incremental improvements and what we have, as opposed to paradigm shifting improvements. And so, that would be a market failure. So I'm curious, those two.
Yeah, a couple things. One is, if you want to know what economic type you are, by the way, there is a test you can go online. It's a site we created called innovationeconomics.org. A little thing, just say take the test. It takes you 10 minutes, and up to pop a picture of Art Lapp or Bob Rubin, Shoemaker, or Keynes, and so take it when you know what you are. And if you're the wrong type for yourself, it's secret. We don't take ideas. Some people are quite embarrassed. On the point about, I maybe misspoke slightly, because I actually think that the innovation economics piece is even beyond market failure. I would argue it's not about market failure. Market failure sort of implies that markets work and there's these failures are outside the norm. Rather, I would say innovation economics is really about just endemic failure. That markets just simply, while some markets work in certain ways that are good, many of these systems we're talking about they're rife with failures. And I would argue a better frame than market failure is innovation systems. So just thinking about, you have an innovation system, and then it goes to Kevin's point in energy. What is that innovation system? Who are the players? Where's the technology? And how do we optimize it? And there's a wonderful report we cite in the report by a Brit named John Barber, who's done just a great study where he just lays it out much more eloquently than I could about why this innovation systems approach is a better frame for it. On the second part, I don't know, Mick and Bill, or about how do we get to breakthrough, Devon, you want to?
Yeah.
How do we not do incremental?
Well, it's not an easy question to answer. If it was, we have those technologies today already. Right? One of the interesting things that I'd like to touch on is this kind of regional element of regional innovation clusters, regional energy innovation. Our partner in Brookings, Mark Murrow, has done really great work on how regions are particularly effective vehicles for translating research and ideas into commercialized products. That happens through collaboration between consortiums of researchers at universities and private companies, as well as venture capitalists, funders, et cetera. So really increasing these collaborations across all of these partners in a regional setting has been shown to be one of the more effective ways of doing this. And I'm actually reading a book right now by Stephen Johnson. If you haven't heard of it yet, you should go out and pick it up, called The Natural History of Innovation, or where good ideas come from, the natural history of innovation. And what he talks about is how breakthrough ideas never happen in a eureka moment, somebody sitting in their bathtub thinking really hard, and boom, there's the idea. It actually happens when what he calls a slow hunch. Somebody has a slow hunch that's been lingering for a long time, and then it comes and it connects with another slow hunch that somebody else has had that's been lingering for a long time. And those two people, or groups of people working together, can ultimately bring the idea to fruition. And also the fact that technology builds on itself. You can really only go as far as what you have available to work with. So those two insights, I think, are something that we need to bring to the table in terms of thinking about how we connect researchers and facilitate the creation of institutions that increase collaboration among consortiums of researchers and scientists and investors.
Just a real quick thing, I'm sure I polled everybody, how many people are aware of this? I've told you, how many are aware of this? How many of you are aware that there's a 20% collaborative R&D tax credit in the Energy Act of 2006? Provides a super sort of generous tax credit for companies to do collaborative research in federal labs or universities. The answer is not very many people, because almost no one's taken the credit, and yet we actually got a provision in the Act. It's a pretty interesting provision to get that kind of collaborative research and networks going. Yes, ma'am.
Let me from Bureau of Economic Analysis. So my question, I think that when we talk about what drives innovation, it's not only the demand pool, but also supply driven. So it's sort of interaction between these two sides. But right now, when we talk about energy innovation, I'm more concerned what's the current status of the U.S. In this field in terms of international competitiveness. Because we know that the current critical patterns, most of the critical patterns in this field are held by the European companies, not the U.S. And then, but if we're talking about in terms of annual investment in clean technology, actually China surpassed the U.S. last year. So, and talking about human capital, a lot of very smart students in Asia start coming to the United States, and I think it kind of, we need to think about where's the niche for the U.S. in this field, and then what's our immigration policies in this field.
Sure.
Yeah. So.
Well, I think that's an issue we just really touched on in the report. It's a critical one, obviously, because one of the benefits of leading in this and doing well in it is the global competitive advantage in the jobs and higher wage jobs that you get from that. I want to let Devon take a crack, because he was the lead author on that report we did, Rising Tiger, Sleeping Giant, which dealt a lot with that.
Yeah, sure. Well, we wrote an entire report about this, and I guess one of the things I'd say out front is that we are behind a lot of economic competitors, not just in Europe, but particularly in Asia. The report that we wrote looked at China, Japan, and South Korea. And one of the things that you guys may have heard in the news recently is that China's about to release a new 10-year energy development plan that is expected to invest $753 billion over the next 10 years in developing new energy sources. Now, this is at the same time that over the last 20 years, China has increased its budget for R&D, total R&D, by 20% every year. It is now investing almost $60 billion in research and development. So they're becoming a high technology power. China should no longer be seen as the country that manufactures cheap goods for U.S. consumption. They are working very hard to become a new technology-based power, and that makes the impetus only stronger for the United States to get in this game, because clean energy innovation is not just about solving climate change and reducing carbon emissions. It's now about creating the industries of the future that are going to supply these new technologies to consumers around the world. And particularly in the developing world, one of the things that I didn't mention in my remarks is that most of the countries in the developing world, where the majority of the new energy demand is going to come from over the next 50 years, will not be willing to impose high carbon prices. They will not be willing to sustain large subsidies for new technologies that become an increasingly larger share of the electricity supply. So that means that if we want to be competitive economically, we need to be offering the technologies that are cheaper in unsubsidized real terms than those of our competitors, which is very difficult right now. There's really not the way that I think we're looking at it from a national perspective.
We are ahead of North Korea then.
We are. We are. We'll look at that in the report.
Well, they don't use very much energy there. Bill, do you want to respond?
Just to add to that, though, which is I think there's a huge opportunity if we could figure out how to bring innovation into this, complex established sector that our current energy system constitutes. So in other words, as I was saying before in answer to Kevin's question, we just don't innovate in places where we've already been. We're constantly on the eye for new territories, right? And as a result, the economy pays a huge price for that, right? And one of the fascinating things that China's doing is obviously it's aiming to get to the frontier of innovation and working hard at making investments in training and so forth. So it's trying to get there. But meanwhile, they're bringing innovation into virtually every part of their economy. And hence, like other emerging countries, they get a big whereas the United States innovates, we really attempt to innovate at the frontier and bring on these big sectors, right? We do these innovation waves every 40 or 50 years. Right? We have this wonderful growth spurt and then it kind of levels off for a while. Suppose we attempted to bring innovation, we figured out how to bring innovation more systematically into our complex established sectors, whatever they might be, transport, healthcare delivery, and so forth. It could be a very interesting kind of feature for U.S. economic growth and U.S. economic well-being over time. So one of the things that really interests me about energy technology is that we might learn some lessons about how to innovate in these complex established sectors. So there's nightmare competition ahead here, but there's some very powerful opportunities that we might catch if we figure out how to do it.
We have time for just a very quick question.
Sure. Stephen Hendrickson from the Department of Energy. So actually building on that last discussion, I think there's understandably a preoccupation with what China's doing, what Germany's doing, what other countries are doing. But when I think about how innovation economics applies to the U.S. context, we require public support to get $25 billion to push in this area requires significant public support. And I feel like there's a gap in Ohio and Michigan and Middle America about we're preoccupied with manufacturing jobs and sort of like these high-end jobs. And I think we need to do a better job of translating what does an innovation system mean for the economy as a whole, so that when the internet was being invested in, people didn't know about Google and Amazon, and they didn't even think in those terms. They weren't thinking, oh, we're going to manufacture computers here. They didn't see what the future looked like. And I feel like in order for this new paradigm to take hold, we need to see more broadly, how to help average Americans understand what that future could look like. And in so doing, you build that political support so that people understand, oh, we're investing billions of dollars because it creates this future that otherwise isn't possible. And I think that's part of it. It's not just a top down. I think you have to kind of seed those ideas at lower levels so that local communities see how they can somehow play a role in that. So it's sort of a comment, but I'd appreciate any thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, look, I'm in agreement with you. It's going to be very hard to put together a formula that politically enables the kind of level of investment for innovation that's going to be required here. So it's going to require us to look hard at a lot of existing streams of funding and better utilize those streams of funding. So DOD is one piece of this. I think the Agriculture Department is potentially a very interesting piece. What are the existing revenue streams that could be leveraged off to give us the kind of funding we're going to need to kind of move in this innovation space? Because I think new funding is going to be hard to find again. So what do those opportunities look like? Where can we find them? I think is one task. But your point about manufacturing is very important. This energy stuff's going to require a lot of manufacturing, but there's another piece here too, which is that manufacturing itself is going to have to get transformed, because it is one of the 4 big spaces in the economy that consumes energy in a way that's going to be completely transformed. So there's an opportunity here to really build some remarkable efficiency into the manufacturing process itself. Now, government policy typically doesn't pay much attention to manufacturing policy or manufacturing process or manufacturing technology. They don't do this. Right? So there's an opportunity here to actually address another complex and established part of the economy in some interesting ways with a whole new driver that can do so in a way that could build some real public understanding and support. So it's an important one.
Great. I think just a couple of quick announcements, and then we will adjourn. First of all, I should introduce my colleague Matt Stepp. Matt is a clean energy analyst at ITIF, so if you want to talk more about the project, feel free to talk to me or Matt. Secondly, December 15th at the Press Club, we are co-hosting a conference with AEI, Brookings, Breakthrough, Third Way, several other groups, an all-day conference that I think will be really very, very interesting, really digging down. It won't be a lot of doctrines and theory. It'll actually be real panels on business folks and technology folks and government folks. So that is up on our website and probably Breakthroughs now, so feel free to also look at that. So please join me in thanking 2 great respondents here, and I appreciate it.